All right, can everybody see this out? See this okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. So just as an introduction, we're going to try to keep this brief to fit the 10-minute time. Just know that we'll be skipping slides that maybe Q&A can answer later, and we're going to be giving a short and land acknowledgement for what that's worth. Just to start, Colin Jodonehi, Chesgikan Tawdon, so Unadata Negatio, Gately Donhi. I'm Iabol, a second-year PhD student at the University of Maryland I School. So to start, Gatnagesa no Janeha ale Uske, Dogi la Sa'i Oni, Jundena Lud, Aniyawia, Junigeli Gai, Unijeli Gon, Junes Nasan, Jinulstene, Jigoslaha, Gandan, UMD Glala, Jundes Wast, Aninakashlank, Aniquiscataweno, Ale Dunda Dudla, Aniyawi, Natnagesa, Idinigohila, Elohila. La Hasko, Nanyehi, Aniyawi Yastahi. I work out of the College Park area of Maryland, located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. The Indigenous Description Group is made up of members across the United States, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We want to show gratitude to the ancestral caretakers of these lands and acknowledge the diaspora of the people that acts of colonization have inflicted. We want to acknowledge the separation, including archival collecting, generates between Indigenous peoples and their homelands. We further acknowledge the continued power and resilience of Indigenous nations and communities, celebrate collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in collections and institutions, and a reminder that we are always on Indigenous land. So here is an overall timeline of the IDG report. We're going to give a brief background on the impetus of this working group and the context in which it was formed, as well as discuss the IGG team and priorities that we've set forth in order to move towards the group's goals. Finally, we are going to discuss the limitations of the project as we see and plan accordingly. So we already know well that scholarship and practice in the archival field have shown pervasive bias in archival description, that archival representation is a relic of colonial power and knowledge systems that underrepresent many marginalized and non-white communities, especially Indigenous ones. And there is a huge need to rethink how this knowledge can be better represented, not only to heal previous harms, but also to make information more accessible and usable for communities. Not only were these things being taken and described for the good of preservation, while the process of assimilation was actively destroying it. So the long history of colonial knowledge extraction, Punzel 2014, have resulted in Indigenous knowledge being dispersed within archival institutions across what is now national borders, making archival discovery extremely difficult for Indigenous researchers and community members. Scholarship and practice in the archival field have shown that pervasive bias in archival descriptions, that archival representation is based on colonial power and knowledge systems that often underrepresent and misrepresent many BIPOC communities, including Indigenous ones. This short video that you can see details some of the processes in which archival records about Indigenous people were made, illustrating some of the issues that I've mentioned. So why SNAC? Potentially, SNAC offers a number of important departures from traditional archival description that may benefit Indigenous community discovery, access, and use. This includes one, the ability to connect disparate and geographically separated records. Again, that SNAC was designed for is ideally one place to find all records related to a particular person or family. Two, it accommodates descriptive flexibility, allowing editors to create their own authority records that fit Indigenous needs, while potentially using culturally appropriate description terminologies. Three, that in turn allow for the focus on Indigenous people, communities, or entities representing collections that are often hierarchically organized by or held within the collections of a white collector or creator. And finally, SNAC allows for Indigenous community members and allies to be trained and work as editors through the cooperative model, hopefully. So people who know the content, understand its complexity, and attend the ethical standards that can be developed. for creating and editing records. So some key concerns that need to be addressed: accessibility to archival collections for Indigenous tribal communities, mitigating harm caused by extractive collective processes, and reparative description across systems at scale in an interoperable way that still acknowledges the local context while making these descriptive practices accessible across institutional and professional lines. So you can watch our presentation from the last two SNAC annual meetings. I'm sure for a lot of folks, that sort of stuff would be a repeat if we were to cover it again. But we want to give a huge thanks to Irene Gates and Catherine Satriano for organizing the first editathon and being leaders on the core team for the second editathon to really get the ball rolling for this work. But ultimately, the main product of this work was the editorial guide. While we pull from multiple sources and it's not exhaustive, we want to change this editorial guide as new protocols, resources, policies, and other documentation becomes available in the field, stuff that the IDG can actively contribute to that ongoing process. As a general note, the predefined choices available in SNAC for certain fields, as well as standards for metadata, are deeply rooted in white supremacist and colonial contexts. Therefore, at this time, the following recommendations are limited by what SNAC platforms can do, and in some cases are limited and expanding outward. So for some more context as to the IDG specifically, we launched the IDG as a part of an IMOS grant that we've been calling Indigenize SNAC, but we hope that the IDG outlives the years of this grant funds. As a part of SNAC governments and the SNAC editorial and standards working group, the group was formed early 2023 to address specific Indigenous specific needs for Indigenous description in SNAC. For the sake of time, going to move ahead. But you can see the team listed on the left. This is the core IDG project team. We wanted to make sure that Indigenous voices were not drowned out by, as well-intentioned as they might be, non-Indigenous voices. But further development of this group will have those kinds of reins lifted as time goes on. But we want to give a huge shout out to the names mentioned so far: Veronica Pipestem, Worthy Martin, Rose Buchanan, Mick Hamilton, Eden Orlov, August Braveheart Sanchez, Ugama Smoke, Lindsay Chapman, Jerica Scala Gates, Lena Ortega, Jared Miller, and Tiffany Chavis. And a huge shout out again to the liaisons and facilitators to help all of this work go by. But we identified 4 primary priorities early in 2023. First off is languages, and we'll hear more about that by Jerry. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. Jerry, you're welcome to take over.
Thanks, Ia. Hold on just a second. I'm going to transition back to my presentation. Okay. So one of the 4 projects that have been identified for the the Indigenous description group going forward is to address the language elements or terms in SNAC or the lack thereof. So we have made language to be one of these big projects, and this is going to come in two phases or two parts. At the request of the Library of Congress, the Indigenous Description Group will make proposals in batches. To be more clear and more specific on that, I am working with Paul Frank, the training department that has a here's his on the slide, LC Policy Training and Cooperative Programs Division. Paul Frank has been a longtime friend of the SNAC Cooperative, and I've worked with him over probably the past 20 years or so, doing subject heading proposals to the Library of Congress subject heading. So Paul was my go-to on this. He's going to be supporting my work here as I work on these language codes for the Indigenous group. Batch proposal number 1 with 39 new Alpha 3 codes requested on August 9th. So that batch has gone forward. I've sent it through Paul Frank, and we will get support from John Zagas of the LC Network Develop and Mark Standards Division to add 39 new Alpha 3 mark codes to the existing mark standards list. It'll be one part of the data set that is in the linked open data feature at the Library of Congress. These are Alpha 3 codes that were before now identified generically as NAI, or North American Indian. So the list you see on the left of the screen is only a portion of the list of languages that do indeed have their own subject headings in the Library of Congress subject heading list, but the languages were all sort of zipped up into a very generic code for NAI, and we are now making the request to Mark Standards Office that each of these languages be given their own language code. The second proposal will be a number of languages, and so far I've only identified about the 15 or so of those that are identified now generically as SAI, or South American Indian language code. And again, we're making the proposal to Mark Standards that these languages be given their own Alpha 3 mark code. So I will hopefully have updates on that for the next SNAC newsletter. That list of South American Indian languages will probably go forward in the next week or two. So then the second part of the language project is going to be, hopefully it will start in October of 2023. Dina and I are going to work as leads for the submission effort for Indigenous language subject headings. Now, you saw on the previous slides that there are a great number of Indigenous languages already represented in the LC subject headings, but as you can imagine, there are many that are not. We are going to work methodically to identify those languages, and then we're going to use Library of Congress's classification web to submit proposals for new controlled headings for those languages. And again, Library of Congress staffer Paul Frank will assist us in this. Okay. That was the language part. Back to Ia and Diana.
Awesome. Yeah, are you screen sharing again, or am I?
I can. My brain's gone. Okay. There we go.
Okay,
Feel free
so
to skip.
Excellent. So thank you, Jerry, so much. And we are so grateful to Jerry and to Dina for working on this. As you can imagine, you know, we spent a lot of time in the early meetings trying to figure out what were some of the priorities, and languages seemed like one of those areas where it has a lot of meaning, and to be able to sort of enhance that pick list for editors to better represent those entities in SNAC. So it's very, very exciting. And this is obviously a bigger impact than even just in the SNAC interface. So we're really excited about this. So that's been our first priority. Our second was boarding schools, and IA ran an in-person boarding school SNAC edit-a-thon last fall. And so we got started thinking about how to do this in a respectful way. Boarding schools are obviously hugely important because of their intergenerational impact and because of how much documentation was involved. That is, as all the other records we're interested in SNAC have been distributed. And there's a lot of existing efforts in Native communities and by other consortia to reconnect and reunify these records. And of course, Deb Holland has also been leading the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to sort of recognize the legacy of boarding schools. So this is an area where we started with an edit-a-thon, and depending on how we work with the Tribal Nation Authority file, we're hoping to work with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition to do something similar to work with the authority file they've already created. For tribal nations, so this is going to be the kind of test case, if you will, that Susan mentioned in her kind of state of the SNAC address. So, you know, we want to make sure that tribal nations are A, represented and B, represented accurately in SNAC at present. Many nations are not represented at all in SNAC, or of course, there's a lot of the typical, you know, merging issues and those things. So we wanted to start with federally recognized tribal nations, acknowledging the major issues with the recognition process in the US and the politicized nature of that, but just to kind of start somewhere. So we're going to work, as Susan mentioned, with the Tribal Nation Authority file that was built by the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and which draws on descriptions of the tribes from the tribe's perspective. So that biographic historical note is going to be coming from a community place. And lastly, as Beth's mentioned, we've been working with the Enslaved Description Group on relationship types. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about citizenship versus membership and identities, and how to sort of relate that in SNAC, as well as the specifics of colonial extraction of knowledge. So not just associated with, but the anthropologists and missionaries and government agents that were extracting knowledge. How do we represent those relationships? So we've had a lot of really interesting discussions about that. And then I just wanted to conclude by just pointing out that we have done a ton, and again, with huge thanks to our whole team, and with huge thanks to Ia, who's done a lot of legwork, to Jerry and Dina for just going above and beyond to support the group. But there's tons of work to do, so we can work on these issues forever. So there's a lot of interest in other categories of information. So thinking more about Indigenous naming practices, place names, going further on subjects. We also, of course, have talked a lot about, as a group and as part of the wider grant project, about some of the other institutional issues that SNAC directs you to, potentially sensitive content. Even though it is a discovery tool, it sometimes points you in that direction. So we want to use the Indigenous Description Group to build relationships between institutions and communities, and to try to use SNAC as a sort of relationship building tool to help institutions rectify their own description practices, in addition to doing the work in SNAC. And I'll skip some of these others on here. I think there are lots of other small kind of what we're calling cultural technical limitations that we're hoping to be able to work through, especially once there's a developer on board. Thank you all so much. And again, we've only been working since March, so we're proud of what we've done so far.